Uh, and I'll start by acknowledging that I'm joining from the unceded lands of the Djadjawurrung and pay my respect to elders and ancestors, and commit, as always, to making country healthy again. And would ask for those with us to say in the chat whose land you're on. We're all, I think it's been a really good experience these last few years, having the opportunity on these kind of fora to not just hear names, but see them written down. I feel like I've been learning countries a lot better since we've been able to see them written. Hello from Jara country. Great. Thanks, everyone. And I just looked as I was signing in for tonight that this is the 26th Solidarity session, which I don't know if that means the pandemic's been really long, or if it's just that we have done a lot of solidarity, which is exciting. This one was inspired by the fact, I was at COP15 last November in my role with the International Planning Committee for Food Sovereignty, in AFSA's role with them that I mostly perform. And people had asked if we could give an update on what happened at the COP, and we've heard also from members some uncertainty about even like how these things come, like what is a COP and why are the numbers so confusing. And so I thought I'd go through a few of those things in case anyone is unfamiliar with those histories, and then also ask whether anyone here, I invite you, by the way, if you're not in a compromising position, to go ahead and turn your cameras on, especially since we're such a small group. Be nice to see you, but I understand you might be in transit or have some other valid reason not to let us see your lovely faces. Is there anyone else here who actually was at either COP15 or COP27, or who has been to a COP before? Because I think we should make sure any others who have had those experiences have an opportunity to share your reflections on them. Or are there no other sacrificial kind of victims who've had to go to a COP? Don't really recommend the experience. Okay, so it's just me. So in which case we tried to be in contact with an organization we know was at COP27, and unfortunately they were unable to attend. So I won't be able to speak to COP27 really at all. I don't know much more about that than anyone else has read in the news, but I think in speaking to the experience at COP15, which is the Conference of the Parties of the Convention on Biological Diversity, you'll get a sense of what how these things are structured, some of the way the discourses play out, the power and how it is soft power and hard power, how they're used, negotiating tactics to get what the parties want from them. But I'll wind back very quickly to the question of the history of the COPs. So there are the three conventions under the United Nations. There's the Convention on UN Framework for a Convention on Climate Change. There's the UN Convention on Biological Diversity and the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. Those three conventions came out of the 1992 Rio Summit. And if you think back to the fact that these are 30 years old, it's 31, it's actually really depressing, because in 92, the Rio Summit was, it was so exciting. We were, all of us had been concerned about the growing global warming, as we said then, was getting worse. And we knew biodiversity loss was accelerating, desertification was accelerating. And at the Rio Summit, it looked like all these countries came together and said, well, we're going to do something about it. Fast forward to November 2022, when I'm at the COP15, and Bolivia actually says, if we had just done what we said we would do in Rio, we would not be here with a new global biodiversity framework to deal with the fact that we've continued to lose biodiversity. So I have to start the kind of discussion about COP15 by saying, are they even worth it? Like, are these global frameworks doing anything? What are we achieving, and why not if we're not? And I'll return to that, I think, in our discussion later, because it's a question I flip back and forth on all the time. And So we still have the triple crisis. They don't actually talk about desertification as much, even though that COP still meets every 4 years. And by the way, so Conference of the Parties, if you don't already know, that's the in the case of the climate change, it's an annual meeting. In the case of biodiversity, it's every 2 years. And in the case of desertification, it's every 4 years. And that's why you have the different numbering systems, why you go, wait, we just had COP27 in Sharm el-Sheik. Why are we having COP15 in Montreal? Like, can't you people count? Because it's the COPs of the 3 different conventions. And they meet different numbers, different frequencies. So that's the history of why you get that. In terms of what they're addressing, they're still addressing climate change, biodiversity loss, and desertification, but the triple crises they talk about now usually are climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. And there's a really interesting book that was just recommended to me through a research group I'm part of called Pollution is Colonialism. I've just ordered it. I can't say how it is yet, but I think it's a really, it'll be a really interesting look at the questions of land use and taking over land and what pollution means in terms of an assertion of ongoing colonialism on unceded lands, and a whole kind of exploration of decolonial praxis and what can any of us really be doing. Oh, Lana, you've read it. Great. Thank you. So I always like to start these things too when we talk about biodiversity loss. You know, we know that we're talking about 9 crops make up 66% of the food grown in the world. We know that from the State of the World's Biodiversity for Food and Agriculture. We know that we have out of 7,345 local breeds of livestock, we know that 26% of them, as of 2019, when the report was published, were at risk of extinction. The loss of biodiversity is just so rapid, it's really concerning. And yet we don't talk enough about the loss of biodiversity in agriculture. We talk about it, as we said in a solidarity session around biodiversity earlier, or last year. We don't talk enough about the actual production. We talk about shelter belts. We talk about the need for native biodiversity. And in fact, most biodiversity officers in government, if you say, what about productive biodiversity? They say, what? And you go, what does biodiversity mean to you? And they say, no, it's just native. We're not talking about other things. And it's so bizarre, like that, the notion of humans being separate from nature being so extreme that even the things that we produce for food get to be separate with us from the rest of nature. And that is intrinsic to the COP15 discussion. So those debates have been very human nature divide discussions. Hence, you have our concerns about the 30-30 target, which was target 3. And that was and it got through in the Global Biodiversity Framework in November, the increasing the number of protected areas to 30% of the world's land, and all land and water. And our concerns about that were that the history of protected areas is extremely colonial as well. And we know the stories of Indigenous peoples being forced off their lands to protect those lands from humans. In the case of like the Maasai in the Serengeti or the Ngorongoro, it's like even worse, because not only are they ejected from their lands, then the sort of capitalist conservation gets to come and run conservation tours and things for, you know, to see nature, if you can pay for it, for the profits of a few, while the people who are intrinsic to that land for a long time are now gone from that land. So we weren't fans of the target originally, but actually I should say we won some good change. There's some really excellent countries in the global south, in particular in Latin America, who have fought really hard for the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities, as they say in the CBD, to get the democratic participation and community-based conservation efforts, rather than not being included in decision-making about their own lands. So there's an improvement to the target. We're not unhappy about it, but it's also a question with the 30-30 target. What about the other 70%? Is this like the Half Earth, campaign that says we'll protect half the earth and we'll all live in the other half and like trash the joint? It's really unclear what Half Earthers mean when they say we're going to protect 50% and separate humans from 50% of the earth. what do we do in that 50% rent? Aside from the fact that it's just a nonsensical thing to be saying, but what do they mean? Do we get to just keep rubbishing on in the other 50%? So as you would know too, in terms of these conventions, really important context is that 20% of the world uses 80% of the world's resources. And so a foundational part of the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, was the debate around whose responsibility is biodiversity protection. We know that most intact biodiversity is in the global south, and the global north really wanted to put the burden on the global south to lock up that biodiversity, protect it from ongoing exploitation and extraction. But actually, the global south doesn't have the resources to fix the problems that are mostly global north countries coming and extracting from those places and taking it to the global north. So what are they called? Shared but differentiated obligations or responsibilities, I think is the language that is used in the Climate Change Convention. It's not actually used so much in the CBD, but that's been a tension from the beginning, and it played out again in Montreal, where you had, like, Bolivia in particular, the strongest supporter of Mother Earth and our relationship with her being really important as we discuss biodiversity, while global north countries, literally in one of the discussions around soil, were saying soil health has nothing to do with human health. Like, I've written that down as a quote from one of them. So very different concepts of our relationship with nature between the North and the South. And of course, that stat that we should never forget, about 70% of the world's food being produced by smallholders. But in the CBD, smallholders are not a recognized constituency. So the UN dropped the UN Declaration on the Rights of Peasants. We had it briefly in a target, but then it got edited out towards the end. So UN DRIP, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, does get mentioned, but they play with language constantly. So instead of principles, including the principles are supported in UN DRIP, they actually watered it down to the fundamental premises of UN DRIP, which is not a legal term, which means, it's not a binding agreement anyway, but it means if you try to fight something out in the courts, you don't have the legal language to back it up. The other one they like is in accordance with versus taking into account. So in accordance with would mean you're following an instrument, and taking into account. I wrote about it after COP15. It's like you get pulled over, you're driving a car, you get pulled over for speeding, and the police says, you were doing 10 kilometers over the speed limit, and you say, I took into account what the limit was, and I just didn't follow it. That's kind of what they're doing when they say they're taking into account. They don't have to follow it. And they do tons of that. So in terms of the way those negotiations go, I've never seen anything so Machiavellian play out. You watch for 2 weeks, and everybody talks about how skillful the negotiators are from Brazil in particular, and also to a lesser extent Argentina. They're considered the best negotiators in the room. Best meaning most effective, not necessarily fighting for what we want. But they come in, and it's so obvious if you're watching it too. Like, I don't see why it's the best. They just come in with the hardest, most ambit claims, like any good union negotiator, and they don't back down until from the most extreme insistence of what will go in a target until the last minute, when they concede, because they're being, they're trying to work in good faith, and they've given so much to everybody, and they're going to let this go, but they never intended to keep all of it in there. There's an example I can give you of the exact text. I'll even just put it in the chat so you can see it, because it's if I can find it again. I had it up before. Here it is. This is the kind of stuff they do. And we're not allowed to, when we're in the rooms, we're not allowed to share textual debates or who's saying them. So this is something Brazil put in the text. Substantially increasing sustainable intensification through innovation, including by scaling up beneficial biotechnology applications for agricultural productivity and stimulating the development of climate-resilient crops, eliminating and phasing out trade-distorting agricultural subsidies, supporting the establishment of seed banks in developing countries. That was Brazil's countermove to Bolivia and Namibia trying to get agroecology into target 10. They said, okay, if you want agroecology, we want this entire paragraph added to the target. And they held on to it until the last day when they accepted just having sustainable intensification and agroecology. They always wanted sustainable intensification in because they're a highly productive and exporting country. And so they managed to hang on to that while they knew they weren't going to keep biotech. But they put it in there anyway, just so they seemed reasonable when they accepted only sustainable intensification. It's a hard thing to watch. So the good news there is, I know, Morelli, it's your people. Well, and of course, this was in the last throes of the Bolsonaro minions, and they were just there. They were there to trash the joint. They were like, we're going to burn it down on the way out. They were really destructive in that space. There were some wins. I'll finish with some wins and then open it up to discussion. Target 10, we did get agroecology in, but it comes alongside sustainable intensification. Target 19, Bolivia got the Mother Earth-centered non-market-based approaches in, but it's a bullet point just under blended financing, hedge funds, offsetting. So it's a very schizophrenic document. And what I would share about that, I think, there's two ways of thinking about this. On the one hand, it's hopeful, right? Because we got agroecology in, because we got Mother Earth-centric approaches, non-market-based approaches in, where 10 years ago, we probably couldn't have got those things into this sort of a document. So it's there. The drawback, and then of course it's there next to the other ones. The question about it is, do we want agroecology to be made that legible in global governance documents? Or will they find a way to regulate agroecology out of its intent, out of its expression, out of its philosophy, because we have made it so legible to the state? And these are questions I'm really grappling with in my PhD research, is how much should we be making ourselves this legible to the state? And when do we need to decide to keep a movement and just deal with some of the more, the smaller, more incremental parts of legislation that we want changed, and keep our concepts to ourselves? I don't have an answer to that question yet, and what's best or what's not, but it's what I'm really, really struggling with. So, for example, there's an agroecology coalition now in the CBD, and that's country member parties, party members, and World Wildlife Fund is a member of the coalition, the Agroecology Coalition. They're also a huge carbon offset, biodiversity offset promoter, because they certify these things. So that's part of their funding model. Is it good that there's an agroecology coalition? It helped get into target 10. Is that a good thing? I'm not sure that it is. The other things that were wins though, DSI, digital sequencing information, which is, basically the dematerialization of genetic resources. So once they are a digital sequence, then do they still relate to the genetic resource? And so are they therefore regulated in the same way under Nagoya and Cartagena? So can they be treated as genetic resources where access to those genetic resources requires the free, prior, and informed consent of First Peoples, and requires the sharing of benefits derived from those genetic resources with those original owners of that genetic resource? In Montreal, they agreed DSI is still a genetic resource. That's like a monumental win for now. I think it's a bit of holding a tsunami back, but we did hold a tsunami back just for now. On the other hand, they didn't agree to putting proper horizon scanning and monitoring and assessment into the document to check for what's next in the biotech space. And target malaria is going ahead in Africa at the moment with tons of Gates money. And so we don't know. There's no precautionary principle being applied to what genetic mutations we're about to see from the open air experiment of things like CRISPR and what is the gene drives. I'm going to stop talking in just a second. Oh, we managed to get nature-based solutions and nature positive out of the document, and that's because those things are very much just code for offset markets. Although nature-based solutions has the potential to be good things, you know, what's wrong with basing a solution in nature? But it has become shorthand for offset markets, and it's used by governments all over the world in that way. And so the social movement strongly rejected that language, and it was taken out, which is pretty amazing considering there was a nature positive, how would you call it, in their like exposition part of the center. I forget the name of it, but like a gazebo, but I can't think of the right word for it. Pavilion. There was a nature positive pavilion funded by the Chinese there, and it didn't make it into the document. Having said that, we came home and Australia has their nature positive plan. It was released on the like 22nd of December or something, like right just at the end of last year. And it's not all bad news. I think Jess has she's sharing a few links there, and there's a summary from Allen's about what it means, the nature positive plan. And that will be informing the development of the NBSAP, which is the National Biodiversity Strategy Action Plan, which every government has to come back to the next COP with in 2 years, right? So the nature positive plan, it's not all bad news. For example, they have said that avoided clearing for carbon credits will no longer be allowed in the offsets market in the ACCUs. So in terms of the formal market for carbon, that's a good change. The integrity of the carbon credits should improve from that, but it's a pretty small glimmer of hope in what is a pretty grim situation with the carbon markets. I watched the Australia Institute Zoom today on Nick Fike's new monthly essay, which came out last week, I think. And that's about coal and gas companies controlling the carbon markets. And it's a lot of it is an expose of serious governance concerns around climate change authority members being chairs or being on boards of carbon market, like carbon credit aggregators, the brokers. So there's all this crossover of governance between government and markets, as it's not hugely surprising, but I think he gives us quite a lot of detail about it. So in terms of the nature positive and nature-based solution stuff, I think we're still not winning there. And as I've been increasingly saying, I said at the Agroecology strategy down at Mornington Peninsula Shire just the other day, the problem I think we're really facing is the hegemonic structures of capitalism that people can't see and don't. And we, you know, that saying, you know, people find it easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. They think it's easier to see the extinction of all species than the end of capitalism. And that's because hegemony is so invisible to people, even whether they're in power or not. And so we have to find kind of utopian ways of thinking, or what Levitas says, you know, is informed and educated thinking. So we need to inform and educate ourselves outside of these structures, and we need to, I forget who said it, alienate ourselves from the structures of the hegemonic structures. And so I'm encouraging people more and more to think of the ways to alienate yourselves from capitalism and feel that sense of alienation, so that we can see when they're putting forward the false solutions like they did in COP15 and like they did in COP27, you know, when they're trying to solve the problems of capitalism with more capitalist solutions, where somebody turns a disaster into an opportunity for more revenue, which is what's happening with a lot of the conservation organizations and other supposedly well-meaning organizations. I'll stop talking there and see if people have questions or comments or discussion. I don't normally talk for half an hour, and I think I just did. No.
Thanks, Tam. I do have a question.
Yep.
I actually have a couple. My first question is in terms of governance and so these agreements and these targets that you have how do you call it? You call it like the principle? No, it's not principles, it's targets.
Target. Yeah, they have
Targets.
goals and targets.
Yeah. To what extent do they become like the parties have responsibility to show some sort of responsibility, like response to them? How does it work? Because what I find with these events is that when they're happening, we get to read a lot about them, and then like they kind of disappear a bit from the media.
Yeah.
And then, for those who are not really fully engaged, we don't actually know then what happens with all the targets and how countries take them inside domestically to do. So how does it work in terms of governance and responsibilities?
So in theory, from these, the countries all go back and they write the NBSAPs that I mentioned before. So the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans. And then every 2 years at the COP, they have to provide a report on how they've gone against their NBSAP. The reality, though, is that like the Aichi targets, which preceded the Kunming-Montreal targets, was the last 10-year plan. Globally, we didn't succeed on any of them. And so it's kind of like school, except you don't fail. You come and you say you got to fail, but you get to progress to the next year, but ultimately as a society, we will have nowhere further to progress if we don't stop failing. So I think there's no repercussions really, except for social disapprobation, basically. And if you're a country like Australia that has such thick skin about failing on targets, does it, or shuffling those deck chairs a little further? Like that's the other thing I heard in the Australia Institute today was that with the with our emissions reduction commitments, the coal and gas projects that are going ahead now, they're all pretty much entirely for export. And so those emissions are not counted in our scorecard, basically. The emissions themselves are exported. And so that's why our government feels comfortable to continue just approving so many coal and gas projects, because it's not going on our emissions record. And people don't realize that that's the safeguard mechanism says that. So it's a lot of it is just bad accounting that lets them look like they might be making some progress, but actually they're just hiding it behind somewhere else. And the other part is, yes, they have to report, but what are they going to do? Send in the army? I mean, Yeah.
Thank you.
Tam, that was a great summary. Apologies if it's difficult to hear me. I'm at the airport.
You sound fine.
And I'm going to have to go soon. But I wondered where La Via Campesina stands in relation to the new agroecology. Did you say it was called the collective, or what was it? The coalition, agroecology coalition. Are they part of that, or are they?
No, none of the actual social movements at this stage have joined it. I think La Via Campesina attends these meetings as a member of IPC. So their view is really represented by those of us there from IPC. And I guess the view right now is sort of cautious. And you know how we decided, La Via and IPC and all of us decided not to participate in the UN Food System Summit because of the co-optation by corporates of that summit. In the case of something like the Agroecology Coalition, we're kind of sitting on the fence, not sure whether being involved might be worthwhile. It's that thing about, we turn up to things like these COPs or FAO meetings because we think you've got to be in it to influence it, and how much worse would it be if we weren't there. But in the case of like the summit, we realized if we turned up at all, they were just going to focus group us so they could co-opt our language and our politics, like they diffuse things more quickly. And the question with the Agroecology Coalition, it's still very new, and countries were joining while we were in Montreal. They were like going, oh, I'm going to get onto the Agroecology Coalition too. So we don't know yet whether it would be more dangerous to put our names on that coalition or not.
Wow, just another actor in the room now.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tam.
Yeah, no worries.
Can I just ask you, when you were talking about Brazil, you're talking about the people that were there and their influence and so on, and they're also connected then to government in that case, which, immediately changed.
These ones were the agriculture ministers, and well, not the ministers, but the like highest up below the minister.
Ah, right. Okay. Because that's what I was really just wondering about, that relationship between kind of public, how hard things can change, when you've got kind of experienced players who may still be around when governments necessarily may change as well. But
yeah, I think like Lula will definitely not keep these negotiators around. I don't like well, having said that, I don't know. Maybe they're just so good at negotiating, they don't actually care which side they negotiate for. Maybe he will keep them. I don't know. But they have been instrumental in weakening the work on the framework. Like it's been torturous having them there and seeing them kind of bully the parties who can only bring a couple. Like Bolivia only brought one delegate for the whole thing. Brazil had like 57. So to show you the difference in how that power plays out too, just in terms of who can fund to have more people there, and it's exhausting. And there are multiple rooms, you can't be in all of them at once. And they'll meet until 3 a.m. And so Brazil just has like an army of negotiators to be sending in. And when they know they're going to have the most difficult negotiations, they send their best negotiators. There's two of them. One they didn't even bring in until about day 4. And he's like something out of a JFK movie. Like he has like even all of these kind of weird little twitches that, and he speaks with a very American accent. And it's like you're watching a performance, and people just stop trying to talk because they know he'll just take over the discussion again. It's the expressions of power are really full on to watch. I don't know what'll happen with the turnover of those particular negotiators. I know in terms of negotiation too, by the way, everyone here knows a fair bit about consensus, I'm sure, trying to achieve consensus and how that's not an uncommon approach in socialist kind of negotiations. And so interestingly, the UN is hardly a socialist global organization, but things are meant to be on consensus. But what happens in consensus seeking is often a lot of expressions of soft power happening silently, and others where you have that one person that won't shift, and you can't get consensus. And so out of 196 parties there, the most blatant example I saw of that was a debate around fisheries, and they were trying to get it out of Target 5. And so the other major fisheries economies had said, we're happy for it to be here because they got it out of, I think, Target 8. And so there was this negotiation about where fisheries would be captured in terms of making it more sustainable and not so damaging for biodiversity. Malaysia, who I did not hear this particular negotiator be especially convincing in their arguments, but the chair said, in Malaysia, you've been holding the line and you've said you won't accept it in this target. Will you concede, and move with the others? And she didn't even say anything except no. And the chair went, oh, well. And then somebody else spoke, like in favor of it being in the target, and somebody else spoke, and the chair came back and said, Malaysia, how about now? Could you see it to accept this in the target? And Malaysia goes, no. Like, that's it. It, like, you can't move. So it just you're stuck, and you have to accept 1 out of 196 refusing. It's infuriating that they can do that. Like they should change the governance rules to at least, I don't know, 2% can say. It could be such a small number to stop that happening. But yeah, it's a very, and that's why if you've read the framework, why it reads the way it does, because it's like a bunch of different personalities who just had their pet thing that they were not going to let go. And so in the end, they had to accept a bunch of things in there that don't even agree with each other. It's a very contradictory document.
So Tam, do you think that it would be perhaps like, do you think that if they had like stronger rules about even the delegations, like to have certain limit of how many, like 57 from Brazil and 1 from Bolivia. Like, is it even okay that there's a space, there's room for 57 people from the same country to be there? Like, there's no rules around that. Like, you
No
can just
rules.
send like delegations as big as you can fund. Is that
No,
how
so
it works?
the only rules are that you can only have like the one delegate speaking in the negotiation, but you can have 56 lined up behind them. And that's also part of their strategy in terms of the meetings that go like till 3 a.m. Instead of closing the meeting at 10:30, which was the original schedule, they say, oh, we're just going to keep going till 12, and then we're going to keep going till 2, and if you've got one delegate, you just can't do that every night. It goes for 2 weeks. And so Brazil just sends enough that they can do it, and they do that, and they just hold. They keep coming back and they'll make tiny little. I shouldn't just pick on Brazil; they're not the only ones, but they'll just make tiny little textual changes to use up time to wear others out. It's so tactical. It's obviously intentional, and no, there's no rules on how many of them can be there.
Wow, that's fascinating, isn't it?
It is.
And to use that kind of structure. I'm very interested to see how it will be in the next one with a different government and so on.
Yeah, I'll
Where
send
there
you then. Yeah, you can go. I don't need to go again.
to fight with the Brazilians.
After dealing with a 4-year-old and a 1-year-old at that stage, you'll find it's easy watching these people try to negotiate.
Yeah, but it will be interesting because now with Lula we have way more talk on agroecology, which is a very popular concept back in Brazil. And even like some ministries and government bodies that Bolsonaro just put it down about like food sovereignty and so on, they're all back. So it will be interesting to see how we reflect in international negotiations. But yeah, okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you know, I think you told me actually that we're already seeing improvements in care for the Amazon, and just things are already rapidly changing. So hopefully we'll see. But having said that, you have to remember Brazil, like Australia, which might sometimes have some decent kind of environmental ideas, is terrible around agriculture, and agriculture controls a lot of these discussions. So even when I was in the Australian follow-up session on Zoom recently about what they're doing since the COP, I asked some questions about what happened with Target 10, and do they have any views on how we're going to, there's 3 parts of Target 10 I was particularly interested in, how they were going to demonstrate reducing loss of nutrient to the environment from agriculture, reducing pesticides, and reducing plastic pollution. And they basically said, well, that's going to be difficult because, we've asked the agriculture department that, and it's with them, and we're not really sure. So environment's like not in charge of that, agriculture is, and I don't think they have particularly good measurements anyway on how much nutrient is being applied, let alone being lost to the environment. So we're bad in the agricultural space, even though we try to make good commitments to controlling invasive pests. Like Australia's really into controlling invasive pests, but tell them to use less pesticides or fertilizer, and they're like, oh, I think, wasn't John looking at that? It's like, yeah. And the big exporting countries in these negotiations, climate negotiations, they're always the problem. So again, that tells us that, we know that the capitalist structures are the problem for all of these things, and finding ways to combat that and help more people see those structures, make them visible to people, help them imagine the end of capitalism. I think that's like a role for AFSA and some of our allies, to really take those things on head on and make visible these invisible power structures, and the fact that we can dismantle them, and in small pockets, we are, and in certain parts of the world they've resisted them for much longer. And so there are working examples of kind of counter hegemonic work that we can build on. But it's a big task, making hegemony visible. People before us have tried.
I think that's why, that the appropriation, I guess, of, terms, concepts of movements becomes so dangerous, because it in a sense solidifies the power, because it makes it appear that things are changing when in fact they're not. I mean, the nature-based solutions is one of those, and there's a lot of talk about that up here in response to the floods. But yeah, it kind of entrenches the power rather than causing any change.
It is, yeah, it is. It's the cooptation of language is one of the biggest ways that this is all done, which is why agroecology is I think one of the things that makes agroecology such a positive and strong force in the face of these kinds of power and cooptation is because it has articulated its principles, its theories of change. And so you can point to those things and say the movement has continued to cohere and says this is what it is, in all of its complexity and diversity. These are the principles of what agroecology is, and it includes the politics of social movements, and it includes participation in decision making. It's not just a substitution of inputs. It's not offsetting it. You can't offset biodiversity, and in being clear, it makes it harder to co-opt. But again, there's a need for us to keep visibilizing these things. Like I said down the Mornington as well, I said apologies in advance if anybody here calls themselves this, but if you ever hear somebody call themselves an agroecology consultant, it's not a thing. Like you can't do co-creation of knowledge and horizontal knowledge sharing if you're a paid consultant teaching us all how to agroecology. Like that's actually the opposite of what it is. So the proponents of these kind of more transformational systems need to keep being really articulate about what they are and articulating them all the time, so that the attempts to co-opt them they find harder to do, basically. Jess asked whether anybody shows genuine commitment to biodiversity and halting biodiversity loss. Yeah, I would say most of those are in Latin America. So Brazil being not a good example of it necessarily, and Argentina not as well at the moment, but Venezuela, Bolivia, Peru, there's actually quite a few countries that I think are good in expressing their solidarity in particular. And actually a surprising number of parties were going to bat for UNDRIP and for including Indigenous peoples in decision-making about country, about making sure their genetic resources were safeguarded. They cited the Eat Best report constantly about Indigenous peoples and smallholders being the best guardians of biodiversity. So you heard that. So Latin America was particularly strong. Actually, Africa has got stronger to a certain extent because we have UN drop now, the rights of peasants, because most of Africa doesn't identify as Indigenous. And so UNDRIP has been harder for them to articulate themselves as rights holders until we got UN drop. And so now that we can articulate the rights holders as smallholders without having to use the language of colonial indigeneity, expressed in reaction to colonialism, it's not that there's no colonialism in Africa, but it's just played out very differently. So those countries, I think, are getting stronger in their language around supporting smallholders than they were previously. And I think the declaration has helped with that. I would say the Anglophone global north are the worst. Probably doesn't surprise you a great deal. Lots of Europe is really big on supporting the notion of Indigenous peoples and smallholders. But then you also get this thing where they're kind of pointing a finger, telling Africa they need to do a better job instead of taking on board their role in the state of the world.
Hey, Tam, just going back to that point that you and Adele were discussing before, and you were talking about the use of the concept of agroecology in these documents and whether it is a dangerous move. because of all the political repercussions that it can have, and the change in the nature of the movement. Do you think that sometimes, like, perhaps, like, instead of using the concept of agroecology, if we use something that it's similar but it doesn't hold as much as a social movement, like, for example, like regenerative agriculture, something that, do you think that it would kind of, because it's still way better than sustainable, it's sustainability and the terms that they're using now, and it still kind of implies much more on the idea of regenerating land and biodiversity and so on, but it doesn't hold that much of the movement that's so anti-capitalistic and so on, that we don't want it to change. Do you think that it would be like a way perhaps of going in, like not going as much for the agroecology itself, but something else that can be also understood in the same line, but perhaps easier to be articulated?
I guess it depends on what they're using it for, right, to answer that question. So if you're talking about how do they try to regulate regenerative agriculture or agroecology, so they say we've got a target that we want, agroecology and other biodiversity friendly farming practices, I think is one of the phrases. What do they mean by that? So, and I take the most obvious example to me is the way the organics movement became the organics industry. Once it went into USD regulation, then inputs went from being only what movement people would have accepted as healthy inputs in an organic system to, copper is fine and there's no limits on how much of an input you use. And so you went from something that was political as well as a change in practices on the ground to something that has a definition and terms and things that are allowed or not allowed in its name in legislation. And so in that regard, would it be safer to have agroecology or regen ag in those documents? Probably regen ag would be safer to have in there. Let them ruin it. They already are. So let them ruin it. And maybe keep agroecology out of their documents, possibly. So hard though. It's like these are really hard. The question of the relationship between the state and the market and who's controlling which things, which are influencing what people can and can't do on the ground, is like, these are the wicked problems of our time, right? But yeah, I'm increasingly of the view that we don't want all our stuff in their documents.
Yeah,
Not
but at
all
the
of it.
same time, you want the concept to grow and to
Yeah.
people to be talking about it, right? And to become part of the change. But then
Yeah.
the
But don't
power.
put it, but baby, don't put it in your constitution. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like leave it in AFSA's constitution. We're going to look after it here, like, a bit more carefully. And yeah, I guess that's part of that theory of change of, AFSA being reformists and radicals too. So take those imperfect democratic structures and systems that we already have, and that we have tons of governance around, chip away at the ones that are really a problem for building this new movement. But over here, let the radicals be in their movement and don't bring us under new systems of governance or old systems of governance. Don't try to slot something radical in something broken. Just keep fixing the broken bits as best you can while you build this over here, and keep it out of legislation, I think, is actually the kind of conclusion I'm drawing more and more. Having just fought tooth and nail for 4 years to get agroecology into Target 10. Like, we take it back. I think it's fine in a global framework, to be fair. Like, it's not like that's legislation that's going to play out at the national level. But at the national level, we need to be really equipped for what does that mean if the NBSAPs say we're going to start bringing agroecology in, and how do we do that in legislation? Then our organizations on the ground need to say, oh, you don't need agroecology itself in. You could just do stuff like the other parts of that target do, about nutrient loss to the environment, about pesticide use. You can keep working on those parts of regulation, and we'll do our systems all right. We'll just follow those guiding principles that we've got, and you get rid of the bad stuff. Well, and I will say, for those who didn't see in the newsletter today, that Mornington Peninsula Shire food economy and agroecology strategy is the first we know of in Australia that's been launched. And again, we got agroecology into policy, and I'm like, oh, we did that. Hope that goes okay. To be fair, most of the document refers to regen ag a lot more than they do agroecology. And I actually think the strategy is trying to do some really good things, and they are understanding the principles of democratic participation from their farmers and local community members to help to then develop that strategy to the next steps. So hopefully it is as positive as it seems. But that's pretty exciting that 10 years or 12 years, I guess, after AFSA really started, we've got agroecology into a local government strategy, and they're behind it, and they want to support local value chain infrastructure and get farmers more involved in decision making. These are great moves forward, I think.
Did they consult with you in the development of that? Like, I noticed in the newsletter that you were there at the
So
speaker,
they did quite a good consultation round, actually, of and they included AFSA in those stakeholder reference groups for like 2 years. We were involved, and then they invited me to keynote the launch, which I also thought was a really good sign. Like, if they're prepared to like know for several years that we have a more radical view than most governments, and they still invite us to launch the strategy, I got to talk about capitalism with quite a lot of capitalists in the room, and that was pretty great. They actually recorded it, so we'll be sharing the recording when it's up. And actually, that was the other thing about that. They then, through discussions as we developed the schedule for that day, decided to have a land sharing panel in the afternoon. So we were there, Joe and I with Tampanieri here with the land sharing agreement we have. And there was somebody from Barragunda talking about their land sharing agreement, and somebody from Uncommon Folk talking about theirs as well. And that ended up being like a really great panel where we talked about the importance of our relationship to land, as well to guide our relationships with each other. And like right down to, you had some fairly wealthy landholders in the room who were considering making some of their land available to young farmers. And they were like, but do you think the relationship is very important, or could we just have a lease? And then to have one of the other landholders say, I think the relationship is really important, because land relationships are really important. And if you're just thinking of this as another transaction, maybe you shouldn't do this. So it was a rich conversation, and I think that was recorded as well. So, I mean, would I have thought Mornington Peninsula was going to come ahead in the anti-capitalist discussions? No. Did that happen there, though? Yes. So I take that as very promising. We talked about hegemony even. It was great.
Yeah, I think it's really cool. And I find the Victorian local government quite interesting, because they're, compared to particularly New South Wales, they're really quite advanced in their food system strategies. But that, what you've just described seems quite different to, like, Melbourne's got its draft one out at the moment for feedback. And like, they just don't have that same framing or angle at all.
Yeah, it's a good point. Maybe I should, Jess, we should probably make a note to contact them, and we should make sure that we put in a submission to the Melbourne one.
And I think there's another one, I don't know pronunciation, Banyul.
Yep.
Yeah, they've got something going on at the moment too.
Well, now that we have such a solid draft of the People's Food Plan, putting submissions into those kind of things is really much easier than previously when we were pulling together, here's 16 things we said earlier, and here's a new idea.
So Banyul's got its first urban food strategy. I haven't read that one, but I did flip it.
Great. Jess has noted it. I see Amy's joining us as we wind up. Hi, Amy. We're just finishing up, actually.
I know.
Nice to hear you anyway.
I meant to get to it all night, but I'll re-listen to it.
Yeah.
How'd it go?
Yeah, it's gone great. I think that's really good though, Amy. Karen, thank you for letting us know about that, because we will make sure we get something into them. And maybe one of the things we can also do is sort of we could write up a little case study about how good a job we think Mornington did with this in terms of the democratic participation all the way through, the fact that they then wanted representatives of smallholders there to talk about their role in their food system, and then send that out through maybe even through MAV or something. I do think Victoria is a little bit more progressive in these ways though, and has been heading in that way for several years, which is good. But it'd be good to see that happen in more states.
Yeah, and I was wondering, because I see all of these updates through Nick Rose, and so I was just looking through his LinkedIn now, which is where I've seen them, and just wondering how much Sustain was involved in facilitating, particularly these 3 updates in really quick succession. So I know that they were involved with Melbourne's, and it looks like maybe annual, but I'm not sure about. Do you know, was Nick and Sustain involved in Mornington Peninsulas? He's posting about it, but I don't know if they were actively involved in facilitating it.
I didn't.
They have been for Melbourne.
No, they definitely weren't facilitating it. I don't remember if they were at any of the consultation sessions. They might have been, but I don't remember.
Yeah, just kind of wonder if that's a point of difference in the way that maybe the groundswell from Mornington Peninsula has resulted in that different perspective.
Yeah, I think governments have a bad habit of handing over coordination of things to consultants and then not necessarily continuing with that more grassroots approach, taking it as a very, come out and focus group everybody. Whereas this did feel much more like they were engaged with the grassroots community, and looking for that little bit of input from slightly further afield, those of us who are not in the Shire, but who have things of value to offer. It was a good process. They have a very good agribusiness officer down there who's been doing this work for nearly a decade, I think, and she's really committed to that local community. Great. Well, 7:30. Great. Thanks for that, Amy. We will have a look at those. Oh God, more food economy strategies. No, of course, we love it. We love it. Thanks very much. Well, thanks all. It's been nice to share all of that with you and to hear the things that you wonder about and what is good or isn't good about these governance spaces. They're complicated rather than complex, and that makes them hard to work in. And yet I think also really important. This is very core business for AFSA to represent our members and the broader community, to make sure that smallholders and local communities and those advocating for localized food systems are in here having our voices heard, and that it's not just the elites making decisions for everybody. So at your service, we'll sign off.
And happy International Women's Day to all
and
of
happy
us.
International Women's Day. Viva!
That's it. Viva! Ciao.
Good to see you, Jorge.